There are places on our planet that appear on every map but remain, in truth, almost entirely unknown. Antarctica is one of them. A vast white desert at the bottom of the world, silent, wind-scoured, and so remote that even modern technology feels fragile in its presence. From a distance it looks empty, a blank page where no story has been written. But those who have studied it closely insist the opposite is true. Beneath the serenity of its endless ice lies one of the most complex and inaccessible landscapes on Earth. And in that immensity, something has begun to stir. For most of human history, Antarctica has been little more than a rumor. Ancient sailors spoke of a great southern continent balancing the world, but no one had ever seen it. Even after it was officially discovered, its isolation shielded it from the usual tide of exploration. While other continents were carved by borders and traded between empires, Antarctica remained untouched, as if the planet itself had decided there was something here that should not be disturbed. More than 90% of this continent is buried beneath ice, so thick it could swallow mountains whole. In some regions, the ice sheet plunges more than 3 kilometers into the dark, pressing down on ancient ground that has not seen sunlight for millions of years. Scientists sometimes describe it as a natural vault. Whatever falls beneath this ice does not simply disappear, is preserved. Locked in time, sealed in the precise moment it was covered, the world changes, civilizations rise and fall. But beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, the past remains perfectly frozen. Yet for all its scientific intrigue, Antarctica is also a place of rules designed not by nature, but by nations terrified of the consequences of unrestricted discovery. The Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, may be one of the strangest agreements in human history. It forbids military presence, restricts territorial claims, and prohibits the kind of deep excavation that might reveal what lies buried below. The continent is protected by laws that allow research but strictly limit how far that research can go. Scientists can collect surface samples, map from a distance, even drill a little but only a little. They are not allowed to puncture the ice deeply. They are not allowed to disturb the sealed layers of time that lie beneath. And so, despite our satellites and sensors and research stations, Antarctica remains an untouched frontier. A place where mystery has been preserved not just by nature, but by agreement. Something about this continent demands caution. Something here resists being known. Even with modern technology, our understanding of Antarctica's underworld is astonishingly thin. Radar has revealed hidden mountain ranges, enormous caverns of air trapped beneath the ice, and rivers of liquid water warmed by geothermal heat far below the surface. But these glimpses are always vague, blurred by thickness and distance. Beneath the ice, the continent keeps its secrets wrapped tightly. And while scientists speak in careful tones about geology and climate, many admit privately that Antarctica is the one place on Earth where the unknown still feels genuinely vast. It is this feeling, the unsettling sense that something sleeps beneath the ice, that has guided researchers for decades. When explorers walk across Antarctica's surface, they describe an uncanny impression that the ground beneath them is not quite still, that the continent is listening, that its silence is not emptiness, but a kind of waiting. There are no cities here, no forests, no noise. Yet the wind that sweeps across the plains sometimes seems to echo against shapes too large to imagine. To the casual observer, Antarctica is hostile, uninhabitable, lifeless. But the scientists who dedicate their careers to this frozen world know better. They understand that Antarctica has never been truly dead. It has only been hidden. That is why when the first reports of an inexplicable anomaly began circulating, the scientific community reacted not with disbelief but with quiet, troubled recognition, as if they had always expected something like this to happen, as if they knew that the ice could only remain silent for so long. But before that discovery, before the photographs and the debates and the global panic, there was only this: a vast continent preserved in secrecy, surrounded by ocean and storms untouched, by war or industry protected by treaties that seem almost too intentional. A continent that anyone can see, yet almost no one is allowed to truly explore. If you stand on the edge of Antarctica, today just beyond the reach of the katabatic winds that rush down from its interior, you can feel the weight of its age pressing against you. You can sense the thickness of the ice beneath your feet, stretching down into darkness older than our species. You can imagine entire landscapes entombed below, untouched since the world was young. Lakes sealed before humans existed, forests trapped in an instant of planetary transformation, and perhaps, as some believe, something far older than forests, something built, not grown. This is the paradox of Antarctica, a land that appears empty but contains more than we can comprehend. A place where history has accumulated layer by layer in perfect preservation. A place designed, it seems, to hide. So when a single anomaly, a shape that should not exist, appeared on a satellite screen, it did not surprise everyone. Not really. For decades, whispers circulated among researchers, explorers, and remote imaging specialists. Whispers of straight lines where none should exist. Whispers of warmth in a place that should be frozen. Whispers of voids beneath the ice too uniform, too smooth, too symmetrical to be natural. The clues had been scattered for years. But it was not until an opening appeared on a remote island at the continent's edge, shaped with impossible precision, that the whispers turned into something else, something urgent. Because if there is one place on Earth capable of hiding a chapter of history we were never meant to know, it is Antarctica. And if even a fraction of its secrets begin to surface, the world will have to confront a possibility it has avoided for a very long time, that we do not fully understand our own past, that beneath the ice lies evidence of something far beyond our recorded history, something that was buried not by accident, but perhaps by design. And now, for the first time, that design is beginning to crack. The anomaly first appeared as a smudgen, almost imperceptible shadow on a satellite pass over King George Island. The operator reviewing the images later admitted he nearly dismissed it. Antarctica is filled with distortions, drifting snow, fractured ice shelves, and jagged volcanic formations that confuse even the most refined imaging systems. But this shadow was different. It didn't scatter, stretch, or ripple like natural terrain. It sat there with a strange stillness, a fixed geometry that caught the operator's attention before he even realized why. When the image was enhanced, the smudge sharpened into a shape. An opening void in the rock face, partially veiled by wind-driven snow but unmistakably present. Most natural caves in Antarctica are chaotic, formed by violent weather, glacial carving, or explosive volcanic activity. Their entrances twist, split, or break unevenly. But this one was smooth, too smooth. Its edges curved with such precision that the analysts reviewing the image paused in silence. It was almost perfectly oval. That alone would have been unusual, but the dimensions were what turned curiosity into alarm. Based on satellite triangulation, the opening was large enough to conceal a small aircraft inside it. No collapsed ice shelf, no wind-scoured hollow, no eroded cliff face had ever produced a space that size with such symmetry. The analysts began pulling older datasets, combing through archived satellite passes, comparing angles, lighting, seasonal changes, and slowly, the strangeness deepened. The entrance had been visible years earlier, fleetingly, momentarily, before disappearing under drifting snow. Then, years later, it reappeared almost exactly as it had before. The same proportions, the same smooth boundary, as if the snow came and went, but the structure beneath remained unchanged. Natural features don't behave like that. They shift, collapse, deform. But this opening seemed immune to the passage of time. More troubling was the silence from the scientific stations nearby. King George Island hosts a cluster of international research bases: Chilean, Russian, Chinese, Uruguayan, South Korean. These teams routinely publish logs about unusual conditions, new crevasses, shifting ice, volcanic tremors, sudden melt zones, yet none of their reports, spanning more than a decade, made any mention of an opening of this size, an omission that made no sense. Researchers on the satellite team attempted to contact personnel stationed there. Some messages went unanswered. Others were acknowledged briefly and then dropped without follow-up. A few scientists replied with the kind of vagueness that suggests someone is choosing their words carefully. The only consistent response was a peculiar one: "We have no data on that formation," but the image said otherwise. When the public access satellite watchers, the global community of amateur analysts who scan Antarctica, obsessively caught wind of the anomaly, they began their own investigation. Frame by frame, they compared imagery from different seasons. They spotted faint linear disturbances in the snow leading toward the opening. Some believed these could be vehicle tracks. Others proposed they were simply wind patterns. But wind does not create lines this uniform, and snow vehicles do not travel to places no station has acknowledged visiting. The more angles they reviewed, the more unexplainable the scene became. At the base of the oval opening, darker shapes appeared, rectangular, evenly spaced, arranged like steps, descending into shadow. At first, analysts dismissed them as shadow artifacts, but under different lighting, during different months, even from entirely different orbital paths, the shapes remained. They did not shift, they did not distort. They simply existed, with a consistency that made no geological sense. Remote viewers began calling it the cave that shouldn't exist, a phrase that spread quickly through forums, research boards, and private chat groups. Some mocked the idea. Others felt a rising unease, because natural formations do not produce geometric shapes. They do not carve their own stairways. They do not appear, disappear, and reappear with identical form. As the debate grew, a separate team cross-examined spectral imaging from the same region. Their analysis revealed something even stranger. The temperature inside the opening was marginally warmer than the surrounding ice. The difference was small, mere degrees, but unmistakable. In a place where cold dominates everything, warmth means activity, warmth means movement, warmth means something is alive beneath the stillness. But if the anomaly were volcanic in nature, as some initially proposed, the spectral signature would have shown mineral outgassing or thermal plume patterns. It didn't. The heat was localized, subtle, contained, like air trapped in a chamber, or machinery left running deep underground. No one could say for sure, and in the absence of certainty, speculation grew. By the third month of analysis, the anomaly had become an unspoken topic inside the Antarctic research community. Scientists were divided into quiet factions. Some believed the entrance was an illusion created by rare erosion. Others insisted the symmetry was too perfect. A few whispered privately that the formation resembled an engineered structure, something carved intentionally. But carved by whom? Antarctica has no record of human habitation older than a few hundred years. No indigenous populations, no ancient settlements, no lost tribes. Nothing in recorded history suggests that anyone ever lived here before the age of modern exploration. And yet the opening on King George Island did not behave like a natural cave. It behaved like an entrance. As pressure mounted, a multinational team of researchers requested permission to travel to the site for ground confirmation. Their proposal was denied. Officially, it was due to weather, instability, and logistical risk. Unofficially, the refusal made the scientific community even more suspicious. The region was not known for extreme danger. Many expeditions had passed near it safely. Why suddenly restrict access now? Weeks later, the opening vanished beneath another heavy snowfall. The satellite community panicked, fearing the anomaly would never be seen again. But then, months after the storm season ended, it returned visible once more, with the same measurements, the same flawless oval, the same rectangular shapes at its base, as if untouched by time. Natural features don't reset themselves. They evolve, erode, distort. But this one held. And as the wind continued to sweep across the island, the entrance looked less like a geological curiosity and more like a door. A door someone had built. A door someone had closed. A door that the ice, for reasons unknown, was now beginning to reveal. Whatever lay inside that opening did not belong to the familiar history of Antarctica. It belonged to something older, something that should not have been there at all. Long before the ice claimed Antarctica, before katabatic winds scoured its surface, and before the continent drifted into the shadows of the polar night, this land was something entirely different. To imagine what lies hidden beneath the frozen layers, one must first strip away the cold peel, back the glaciers, melt the ancient sheets, and reveal the world that existed millions of years ago. Only then does the mystery begin to make sense. When scientists first drilled into Antarctic sediment in the late 20th century, they expected barren mineral dust. Instead, they found pollen-dense vibrant, unmistakably belonging to warm climate plants. It was a revelation that shattered everything the modern world assumed about this place. Antarctica, the symbol of desolation and cold, had once been a lush, thriving ecosystem, a world of forests and flowing rivers, inhabited by creatures that would seem impossible here today. Further drilling revealed fossilized leaves, so fresh in detail that the veins and cellular structures still appeared etched into the stone, as though the forest had been frozen in the moment of its final breath. Then came the upright tree trunks, giants of an ancient woodland still standing exactly where they grew. Their roots remained anchored in soil that had not seen daylight for millions of years. This was not a forest disrupted gradually by climate change. It was a forest entombed suddenly, abruptly, as if the world had shifted overnight. The discovery of dinosaur remains made the picture even more vivid. Large herbivores and predator species roamed what is now a frozen wasteland. Fossils of giant flightless birds suggested ecosystems similar to those of New Zealand or South America. All of it pointed to a warm, temperate environment with abundant life. A place where rivers flowed through valleys and green canopies stretched across landscapes now buried beneath kilometers of ice. But these findings raised an unsettling question. How could such a paradise transform into the coldest place on Earth with such speed? The answer lies in the story of Gondwana, the ancient supercontinent that once united Antarctica with Africa, South America, India, and Australia. According to geological records, Gondwana began to tear apart tens of millions of years ago, splitting along deep fractures in the Earth's crust. Antarctica slowly drifted toward the south, moving into regions of diminishing sunlight. As global temperatures dropped, ice formed. As the ice thickened, sunlight vanished, and eventually, the entire continent froze. But there is a detail often overlooked in this explanation. The freeze was not slow everywhere. In some regions, particularly those where the forests were found, the transition appears to have been almost instantaneous. The preservation of upright trees, of leaves that show no signs of decay, suggests a rapid burial under extreme conditions. Something happened here that sealed the land in an instant, trapping everything in place. If this is true, then anything built before that moment, any structure, any artifact, any sign of intelligent activity would have been preserved perfectly, locked under ice so thick it could survive the rise and fall of continents. This is the thought that unsettles researchers who study the continent's past. Antarctica is not just a frozen desert, it is a time capsule, and unlike other regions of the world, where erosion and tectonics destroy the evidence of ancient civilizations, Antarctica preserves this idea, though speculative, explains why the anomalous cave on King George Island stirred such unease. If Antarctica once hosted forests, rivers, and complex ecosystems, then it could have supported more than life. It could have supported intelligence. And if any trace of that intelligence remained buried before the ice advanced, it would still be there, unchanged, untouched, waiting. The cave's geometry suddenly seemed less like an isolated mystery, and more like a clue in a much larger puzzle. For decades, scientists had quietly cataloged unusual patterns under the ice, patterns they could not explain. Straight lines that should not exist in nature. Sharp angles buried beneath sediment, rectangular voids with no geological precedent. These data points were dismissed as imaging artifacts, radar interference, or mere coincidence. but taken against the backdrop of a warm, ancient Antarctica, the pieces began to align. Consider a vast continent, temperate and fertile, connected to other land masses by walkable terrain. Creatures migrated here freely, climates supported diverse species, life thrived. In places where conditions are stable and resources plentiful, life tends to evolve upward toward complexity, toward creativity, toward civilization. And then, suddenly, a wall of ice swept across the land, catching everything in its path and preserving it exactly where it stood. This is not to suggest that humans or anything like humans once lived here, but the possibility that some advanced species, known or unknown, passed through or settled temporarily is not beyond scientific imagination. If Antarctica was once a green world, why couldn't it have been visited, used, or even inhabited at some point in the distant past? It is this question that troubled the geologists reviewing the cave anomaly, because the more they examined the data, the more the opening resembled something intentional not in origin, but in design. Natural formations do not carve perfect curves. Natural processes do not leave stair-like shapes at precise intervals. Natural caves do not appear and reappear with identical contours after years buried beneath snow. Yet here it was, a doorway that behaved as though it was waiting to be found. The idea of an ancient civilization surviving beneath the ice is not mainstream science, nor is it what most researchers believe. But the unexplained features found across the continent's straight ridges, rectangular depressions, perfectly aligned voids suggest forces at work that we still do not fully understand. Many scientists argue that tectonics, volcanic flows, and unique patterns of cryogenic pressure could produce shapes that mimic intelligence. But others quietly admit that we cannot rule out the possibility of something more. And that is the heart of the mystery. Antarctica hides not one past, but many. Layers upon layers of Earth's history lie compressed beneath its ice, preserved like pages in a book no one is allowed to open. The fossil forests, the sudden freeze, the geometric anomalies, and now the entrance on King George Island, all of them whispered the same message. This place has a memory, and it has not forgotten what it witnessed before the ice. The deeper researchers looked into the continent's past, the more they realized that the anomaly was not an accident. It was a hint, a signal, a reminder that Antarctica was once alive and that something buried within it may still be waiting. If the cave on King George Island had been the only anomaly, scientists might have eventually dismissed it as a quirk of erosion. Strange, yes, but not unprecedented. Antarctica is vast. Its ice carves unpredictable shapes, hides fractures, opens cavities, and closes them again with each passing winter. But as researchers widened their scope, the continent began to reveal something far more unsettling. The cave was not an isolated oddity. It was part of a pattern, a quiet network of geometric signatures, buried deep beneath the ice, repeating across distances that defied coincidence. The first hints came from radar teams working in East Antarctica decades ago. They detected long, linear ridges beneath the ice-straight ridges, stretching for miles. At the time, researchers assumed these lines were artifacts caused by interference in the radar equipment. Nature does not create perfect lines. And yet the lines persisted, even after the hardware was upgraded. Even after different teams, using different instruments, scanned the same regions. The ridges were real. What drew even more attention was their spacing. Each ridge ran parallel to the next, separated by distances so consistent that some analysts quietly compared them to engineered foundations. Not walls, not roads, but something older and larger, maybe structural beams. Maybe supports, maybe the outlines of something long forgotten. Natural formations bend, twist, curve. They follow the chaotic logic of geology, but these ridges held straight as though guided by an unseen hand. Then came the rectangular impressions. In the frozen heart of the continent, where temperatures plunged low enough to fracture metal, satellite imagery revealed faint but unmistakable shape shadows of rectangles so large they dwarfed modern stadiums. Their corners were sharp, their edges defined, and their proportions uniform across multiple scans. At first, researchers thought they might be collapsed caves or old volcanic chambers. But collapsed caves are irregular. Volcanic chambers are chaotic. These impressions were orderly, almost architectural. The shapes appeared in multiple clusters, spaced apart by distances that suggested intention. You could almost imagine a blueprint hidden beneath the ice, an arrangement of platforms, chambers, or foundations that once belonged to something capable of exerting its will on the land. No official report ever claimed this, of course. The language of science avoids implication. But inside private communication channels, the questions grew louder. What natural process leaves behind the ghost of rectangles? The truth was that no one knew. As the anomalies multiplied, one discovery pushed the conversation even deeper into uncertainty. Near the Gamburtsov mountain range, an underground mountain system, larger than the Alps, radar scans detected a canyon stretching for hundreds of miles beneath the ice. It was deeper than some of the most famous canyons on Earth, yet completely hidden, sealed under a lid of frozen time. But depth was not what disturbed the scientists. It was the terraces. Along the canyon's shadowed walls, radar reflected off repeated horizontal surfaces, flat, evenly spaced, stacked like giant steps leading downward into darkness. Natural erosion can create steps, yes, but never with such uniformity. never with such repetition, never in a place untouched by water for millions of years. These terraces suggested something else: alteration, or presence, or purpose. Still, the data could not explain the most baffling phenomena, those found in Antarctica's subglacial lakes. Over 400 of these lakes lie beneath the ice, trapped for millions of years, untouched by sunlight. Many behave as expected, with chemical signatures shaped by minerals and pressure, but a handful exhibit magnetic readings so unusual that scientists have struggled to categorize them. Their magnetic fields shift unexpectedly, as though influenced by something metallic, something structured, something not of the lake itself. One such lake sits beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice. Its magnetic signature pulses faintly at regular intervals, a behavior that no known mineral or geological formation could produce. Some researchers suggested the readings were caused by equipment malfunction. Others insisted that the phenomenon was consistent across different missions. If something beneath that lake was generating or distorting magnetic fields, even slightly, it would imply the presence of material that did not belong in a glacial basin, material shaped by intelligence, or shaped into something intelligence once used. Between the ridges, the rectangles, the terraces, and the magnetic lakes, a picture began to form, not clear, not confident, but unavoidable. Antarctica was hiding geometry, structures, patterns, repetition, the language of design. But the anomalies did not end there. Deep scanning missions, those rare projects allowed to probe the continent's underside using high-frequency radar, detected elongated voids winding beneath certain mountain regions. These voids were long, smooth, and remarkably consistent in width, sometimes stretching for dozens of miles. They lacked the chaotic contours of lava tubes and the jagged edges of ice caves. Instead, they curved gently, maintaining their dimensions as though carved by something that understood symmetry and direction. A natural cave can be large. A natural cave can be long. But a natural cave does not hold the same width, the same curvature, the same exact structure, mile after mile after mile, unless it wasn't natural at all. This is the point at which the scientific community became divided. Some argued passionately that Antarctica's extreme conditions, combined with unique geological pressures, could create shapes rarely seen elsewhere. They urged caution, warning against jumping to conclusions that bordered on myth. Their voices were steady, rational, grounded. But others quietly, often anonymously, expressed a different view. They pointed out that no other continent on Earth displays this combination of anomalies. No other region hides so much symmetry beneath so much ice. No other landscape produces geometric echoes on this scale. They wondered whether something had existed here long before the continent drifted south, something capable of leaving a physical imprint on the land, something that vanished before the freeze, leaving only its foundations behind. Yet the most curious part of this story is not the anomalies themselves. It is the way they seem to align. The long ridges, the rectangular impressions, the stepped canyon walls, the magnetic lakes, the tunnel-shaped voids, each one taken alone could be dismissed. But taken together, they form a constellation of evidence that points toward a single unsettling possibility. The cave on King George Island may not be the beginning of the mystery. It may be the entrance, a doorway into a deeper story. A story written not in books or myths, but in ice. A story the continent has been trying to reveal piece by piece, pattern by pattern, as though guiding us towards something buried far below, something that was never meant to be forgotten. For years, the anomalies beneath Antarctica were little more than silent signatures, lines, shapes, voids, half seen through layers of ice so thick they muffled every clue. But the moment the King George Island opening was confirmed as stable enough for closer study, the world of remote sensing reached a turning point. If satellites could not fully explain the anomaly, and radar only hinted at deeper architecture, then the next step was inevitable. Send machines closer, peel back the layers of ice, not with shovels or drills, but with precision, light, and sound. The first team assigned to the anomaly used a high-resolution imaging platform, designed to detect microcontours invisible to standard satellite imagery. When the results came in, every researcher who saw the renderings said the same thing. The curves of the opening were wrong. They were too clean, too disciplined. Real erosion in Antarctica produces fractured edges, splintered rock, chaotic openings shaped by violent freeze-thaw cycles. But the cave's entrance looked as though it had been drawn with a compass, one unbroken arc after another. Natural formations do not compose themselves like that. They do not mirror their own curvature so precisely. The imaging also revealed faint striations along the interior rim, parallel marks that ran with an almost mechanical consistency. Some analysts proposed they were the result of ancient ice flows scraping against the rock. Others argued that the spacing was too uniform, too deliberate, as though something once pressed against the stone with intention. Either explanation strained the imagination, yet neither could be dismissed. Still, the strangeness deepened when thermal scans arrived. Antarctica is a world ruled by cold, and inside the cave mouth, temperatures should have plunged instantly. But the thermal images showed subtle warmth, barely perceptible, yet consistent, emanating from deeper within. The warmth did not fluctuate with weather patterns. It did not mirror surface changes or reflect sunlight angles. It remained constant, as though sustained by something internal. There were theories, of course, A pocket of air trapped for centuries, a geothermal seam hidden beneath layers of volcanic rock, or, as some researchers whispered privately, an enclosed space that retained heat exactly the way built structures often do. But no one was ready to say that out loud. Not yet, because something else demanded attention. The drone. When the first unmanned aerial vehicle approached the entrance, the team monitored it with clinical detachment. Antarctica is notoriously hostile to drones' winds. Shear their rotors. Ice fog corrupts their sensors, and the cold drains their power. The engineers fully expected the drone to struggle. What they did not expect was how smoothly it entered the opening, gliding through the air as though the cave's interior shielded it from the elements. The wind dropped, interference faded. It was as if the drone had crossed an invisible threshold, leaving the chaos of Antarctica behind. Inside, its lights illuminated the first undeniable sign that this structure did not obey the logic of nature. The tunnel. Natural caves wander. They twist, bend, spiral, widen, contract. But the drone's LiDAR scan returned a perfectly straight passage, so straight that when the data was overlaid onto a digital grid, the corridor aligned almost exactly along a cardinal axis. It extended deeper than the drone's range could measure, a single unwavering line cutting through the mountain with architectural precision. But LiDAR alone was not enough. The drone had to venture deeper. As it advanced, its cameras caught the play of light across the tunnel walls. There were no jagged edges, no erratic chiseling by water or wind, no chaotic fractures. Instead, the surfaces gleamed beneath the drone's beams, smooth, planar, almost reflective in certain angles. Some scientists insisted these were merely ice-coated rock faces polished by ancient glacial movement, but glacial polishing produces curves, not angles. It softens, it rounds. Yet here the angles were sharp, crisp, as though sculpted. Near the entrance, the drone also captured images of the rectangular shapes at the base, those shadowy forms that had puzzled analysts for years. What the drone saw confirmed what satellite imagers could only speculate. These were not shadows at all. They were physical structures, rigid, immovable, and arranged with purpose. The snow fell on them, melted, refroze, yet their outlines never changed. Natural formations buried under seasonal frost shift subtly each year. These did not. Even more troubling, the radar pulses penetrating the floor of the opening revealed something unexpected. Density variation. Beneath the surface layer, the material grew heavier, more compact, more resistant to penetration. Not stone, not ice, something else. Something layered. Something that absorbs sound waves instead of scattering them. A signature more consistent with engineered composites than geological formations. The scientific team reviewing the radar data struggled to reconcile the readings with known materials. One analyst suggested volcanic glass. Another proposed metamorphic rock compressed by unimaginable pressure, but neither explanation accounted for the uniformity. Geological materials vary. They bloom irregularly. They fracture, scatter, warp. Yet the subsurface readings here were consistent to consistent. As the drone ventured deeper, its sensors detected subtle reverberations along the corridor, vibrations, echoes of something distant too rhythmic to be random, too faint to identify. Some believed it was interference caused by the drone's own rotors. Others insisted the echoes came from further inside the mountain, reflecting down the straight corridor like a whisper sliding along the edge of a blade. Then came the moment that changed everything. The drone reached a point where the tunnel widened slightly, revealing the topmost steps of what could only be described as a staircase. Not a natural descent, not a slope, not a series of breaks in the rock, but steps. Evenly spaced, uniform in height, identical in depth. The drone's cameras hovered over them, capturing each line, each boundary, each impossible detail. Natural formations don't do this. They fracture, they crumble, they collapse. They do not carve stairways. The discovery sent a silent quake through the research team. No one spoke at first. They simply watched the images appear, frame by frame, each one confirming what their training forbade them from concluding. Someone or something had shaped this place. Yet the tunnel continued, and the drone had only begun to touch the surface of a mystery far larger than any of them anticipated. Because the cave was not a cave. It was an entrance. A threshold. A doorway built into a continent that should have been empty, untouched, silent, and whatever stood beyond that doorway was waiting. The staircase descended into a darkness so complete that the drone's lights seemed to dissolve before they reached the floor. For a long moment, the operators simply stared at the screen, unsure of what they were seeing or whether they were meant to see it at all. Natural caves do not craft staircases. Ice does not carve in straight, intentional lines. Stone does not, under any known circumstance, produce steps that hold their form unchanged across millennia. And yet here, beneath one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, a staircase waited as though expecting visitors. The drone hovered over the first step. Its sensors registered a sharp boundary, as if detecting a material transition. This alone was disturbing. In nature, erosion rounds edges, smoothing transitions between levels. Here, the lines were crisp, the corners sharp. You could almost imagine the edges cutting into the air, precise enough to slice through certainty itself. The step surfaces were unusually flat, too flat in the way only engineered platforms can be, reflecting the drone's light in a uniform sheet. As the drone lowered itself onto the first step, there was a measurable drop not in temperature, but in sound. The audio feed shifted abruptly, the way sound changes when one moves from an open space into a sealed structure. The tunnel above, cold and silent, had behaved like a natural cavity. But here, on the staircase, the acoustics were different, controlled, contained, artificial. Descending slowly, the drone followed the steps into a vast chamber whose proportions defied the expectations of every scientist watching. The ceiling lifted high above, disappearing into shadows. The walls seemed to stretch outward with impossible symmetry. No jagged rock, no uneven ice, no signs of collapse or age or natural decay. Instead, smooth planes formed geometric boundaries, creating a space that felt enclosed yet impossibly large, something between a hall and a vault. The floor of the chamber drew nearly all attention. At first glance, it looked like ordinary soil, dark, powder-fine, but as the drone moved across it, the ground absorbed light instead of reflecting it, swallowing brightness like a void disguised as dust. When the light shifted, faint striations appeared, thin layers stacked upon each other, delicate as the pages of a book. Soil does not behave this way. Sediment does not preserve itself with such uniformity. Only something untouched for immense spans of time could accumulate such a pattern. Something preserved by conditions so stable that even time itself seemed reluctant to disturb them. One scientist suggested it might be volcanic ash. Another proposed organic decay. A third pointed out that the layering indicated no exposure to air or water for millions of years. The sediment's behavior under the drone's lights, absorbing instead of scattering, could not be explained by anything known to geology. It was as though the material was manufactured, or at least altered by forces not yet understood. But the room's greatest mystery sat in its center, a depression carved into the floor, circular and flawless, its edges smoothed into a continuous arc. The shape was unmistakably intentional, too perfect, too shallow, too symmetrical. It resembled a basin, or a pool, though it held no water. Instead, at its lowest point lay a thick, black substance, viscous, unmoving, dense enough that the drone's sensors struggled to determine its depth. As the drone drifted forward, the substance reacted. It happened gradually, like a subtle shift in gravity. The drone stabilized itself automatically, compensating for what it assumed was turbulence. But the air was still. No wind, no drafts, no external pressure. And yet, the drone continued dipping lower, pulled as though by an invisible force. The operators tightened their controls, adjusting altitude. The drone resisted, sinking another few centimeters toward the surface of the black mass. Something inside the pool was drawing it in. When the drone's lights hit the substance directly, faint ripples appeared barely visible, as though something beneath the surface inhaled or stirred. The drone struggled to maintain balance, its rotors fighting a downward drag. One operator shouted for a full-thrust vertical lift. Another initiated emergency stabilization. Slowly, painfully, the drone began to rise again, its motors straining. Only after several seconds of near failure did it finally break free of the invisible pull. The entire control room fell silent. Substances do not exert force on objects without physical contact, at least. None that conventional science recognizes. Magnetism, impossible. The drone's frame was carbon composite. Gravity anomaly, unlikely but not impossible. Something else. No one could say, but the black residue at the bottom of the basin had behaved as though it were aware of the drone's presence. A few unverified reports later claimed that the substance shifted in subtle ways just before the drone escaped, hinting at motion independent of external disturbance. Though these accounts were never officially confirmed, the footage showed enough movement to spark debate and fear. The drone's retreat revealed something else in the chamber, a structure embedded into the far wall. A massive slab, rectangular, monolithic, towering from floor to ceiling. Its surface was smooth, almost polished, but faint markings, scratches, grooves, or something akin to tool impressions etched across it in patterns no one could decipher. The slab did not match the chamber's walls. It looked placed, installed, positioned with intention, like a door, like a seal. Behind it, radar confirmed the presence of additional spaces, hollows, chambers, tunnels branching in multiple directions. But the slab blocked all access. It was a barrier and a warning. The drone approached the slab cautiously. When its light swept across the surface, small reflective glints shimmered, mineral flecks, or perhaps something else embedded in the material. The drone extended its scanning arm toward the slab, but before contact could be made, a sudden surge of interference disrupted the feed. Static flooded the transmission. Sensor data spiked into incomprehensible patterns. For a moment, the video cut out entirely. When the feed returned, the drone had drifted backward several meters, as though pushed, but nothing had touched it. The operators froze. The slab remained still. The chamber returned to silence. Yet something in that moment, something in the interruption, the jolt, the way the drone had moved, made every person present understand the same truth. This was no cave, no natural hall, no geological accident. This was a structure, a place built deliberately, shaped with intention, buried and sealed before ice swallowed the continent. A place that had waited through ages for the moment, a machine small, fragile, curious dared to enter, and within its dark geometry, it held answers that the ice had tried to keep hidden. The moment the drone escaped the pull of the black residue, the research team realized the chamber was not simply an architectural anomaly. It was active, responding, interacting, behaving in ways nothing inert should. Machines fail, sensors glitch, radar interferes. But none of those malfunctions explain why the drone had seemed to struggle against a force neither visible nor identifiable. And none explain why the basin in the chamber's center reacted as if it recognized movement above it. In the hours that followed, the drone footage was replayed again and again, slowed down to fractions of a second, magnified until individual pixels blurred into abstraction. At first, the investigators focused on the drone's descent into the basin. The downward pull was subtle, so subtle that without instrumentation, it might have been mistaken for a routine stabilization issue. But the telemetry was clear. A measurable external force acted upon the drone. Then they examined the ripples, those faint, trembling distortions on the surface of the black residue. Under normal circumstances, viscous material only shifts when disturbed, but the drone had not touched it. No air displacement was strong enough to cause that reaction, yet something inside the basin had stirred, almost imperceptibly, like a creature reacting to light after an eternal sleep. The implications were unsettling. If the substance was organic, it was unlike any biological material ever recorded. If it was inorganic, it defied physical behavior, and if it represented a technologist, something designed, it exceeded the conceptual limits of anything humanity has built or even imagined. Still, the greatest shock was not the basin itself. It was the slab. The researchers shifted their attention to the moment before the interference. As the drone approached the rectangular monolith embedded in the chamber wall, a strange tension seemed to saturate the air. The lighting changed subtly, as if reacting to the drone's movement. Then the interference surged, violent, sudden, total. For a few seconds, the feed dissolved into static, and when it returned, the drone had been relocated within the chamber. Relocated, not drifted. In the footage, no rotational motion was visible. No corrective stabilization pattern appeared in the logs, yet the drone moved several meters instantaneously. It was as though the chamber itself rejected its approach. The slab remained motionless during the event. Its surface was an unbroken plane of muted reflection, with the faintest suggestion of etched lines barely visible beneath centuries of sediment and ice. No hinge, no seam, no mechanism. And yet the more researchers studied it, the more it resembled a sealed doorway, an entrance to something deeper. Some suggested initial testing with directed sonar pulses to examine its density, but preliminary radar mapping had already shown unusual inconsistencies. Sound waves vanished into the slab as though absorbed. It returned almost no reflection. The material behaved less like stone, more like a barrier designed to conceal. It was then that a quiet, troubling question hovered over the team. If this is a door, what is it meant to keep contained? And even more, who sealed it and why? These questions escalated quickly once the footage spread beyond the research circle. Scientists, usually cautious with speculation, now found themselves divided into two conflicting camps. One camp insisted the phenomenon had a geological explanation and known, yes, but still natural. The other camp argued, cautiously but firmly, that such geometry, such structure, such behavior, could not be explained by Earth alone. Debate turned to conflict when the black residue became the focal point of analysis. Experts noticed something unusual when they studied its optical behavior. Most substances absorb light in irregular waves, reflecting some frequencies more than others. But the residue showed a pattern of absorption nearly uniform across the visible spectrum. This meant something profoundly rare. The material was not simply dark. It was intentionally designed or evolved to swallow light. Its purpose was to hide, not reflect, to obscure, not reveal. A physicist pointed out that certain engineered nanomaterials mimic this behavior. But these materials require controlled environments and modern manufacturing capabilities. The thought that anything similar could exist beneath Antarctica, in a structure predating civilization, bordered on impossible. Yet there it was. Even stranger were the force signatures recorded when the drone tried to ascend. A downward acceleration anomaly, something like a gravitational tug, though not strong enough to trap the drone completely. Forces like that do not occur in sealed chambers without moving mass. But the residue didn't move. It merely responded. Some researchers wondered if it was reacting to heat signatures. Others believed it might respond to electromagnetic fields. A small but vocal group suggested intelligence. The idea of intelligence living or sleeping inside a sealed basin, hundreds of meters below. Antarctic ice ignited global fascination and fear. Social media platforms exploded with theories. Some said it was ancient, some said extraterrestrial. Some said it was a remnant of a forgotten epoch of Earth destroyed or abandoned long before humans emerged. Government agencies took a different approach. Within days of the footage leaking, multiple countries requested closed-door briefings. Officially, the requests were framed as concerns about safety and the need for coordinated scientific oversight. Unofficially, the world suspected that geopolitical interests were awakening. The idea of a hidden structure, potentially a technological relic, was too valuable to ignore. Nations began to position themselves diplomatically and strategically, knowing that Antarctica's untouched nature made any claim extremely delicate. Some governments ordered immediate restrictions on travel near King George Island. Others increased surveillance around their Antarctic stations. A few quietly deployed additional personnel, under the guise of routine rotation, but everyone understood the truth. No one wanted to be the last to know what lay behind that slab. Inside the academic community, tensions escalated further. Veteran geologists strained to trust slow processes and predictable patterns, felt the ground slipping beneath their assumptions. Archeologists, baffled by the implications, speculated about civilizations older than any in the known record. Physicists debated anomalies. Biologists pondered the residue. And yet, across all fields, one emerging thought united them. If this chamber is artificial, then it is not alone. Nothing built at such scale exists without purpose. Nothing sealed beneath 4 kilometers of ice is sealed casually. And nothing responds to a drone, nothing interacts, pulls, pushes, or interferes unless it is part of something larger, something designed, something connected. The realization settled like a weight. The chamber was not the mystery, it was the threshold, a fraction, a hint, a single piece of a structure that likely extended far beyond anything the drone had glimpsed. And somewhere behind that sealed slab, beyond the interference, beyond the darkness, something waited in silence. Not forgotten, not dead, simply sealed. For a reason no one yet understood. When the interference that struck the drone subsided and the machine steadied itself again, the research team realized there was no longer any question about the nature of the slab. It was not a wall. It was not a geological oddity. It was a barrier placed, positioned, sealed with intention. The footage made this unmistakable. The slab did not resemble anything natural found in Antarctica's subterranean environment. It was too smooth, too vertical, too perfectly aligned with the chamber's geometry. It stood like the silent guardian of something older and more carefully hidden than the team had ever imagined. And yet, what lay beyond it remained unreachable. Attempts to scan deeper into the slab had already proven futile. Low-frequency radar, capable of penetrating kilometers of ice, vanished into its surface as though swallowed by darkness. Sonar pulses returned, faint echoes, muted and blurred, as if the slab absorbed not only sound but information itself. Even electromagnetic scans, designed to reveal mineral composition or metallic content, flickered with interference the moment the signal approached the slab's boundary. It was, in every measurable way, a technological black box, one that refused to reveal its secrets. Still, faint glimpses emerged, not from direct scanning, but from the echoes that managed to slip around the slab's edges. Some pulses returned, shape soft, ill-defined, but distinctly present. Caverns arranged in patterns too orderly to be natural. Vertical shafts running deeper than the mountain's base, parallel corridors extending outward like veins in a labyrinth. It was as if an entire subsystem, rooms, tunnels, chambers lay just beyond reach, a hidden architecture sealed away before the ice ever touched the continent. One geophysicist described it with careful hesitation. It behaves like a structure buried inside another structure. The phrasing sounded impossible, but the data supported it. The slab was not the entrance to the chamber. It was the entrance to something deeper, something protected by a design that eclipsed human understanding. As the images spread beyond the research station, global attention sharpened. Governments already alarmed by the drone footage now demanded exclusive access to deeper readings. But the station scientists resisted, insisting that the data must remain within the scientific community until properly studied. Their resistance, however, did not last long. Within days, military aircraft from multiple nations appeared in Antarctic skies, not armed, but unmistakably present. Antarctica had no borders, no ownership, yet suddenly everyone behaved as if the land had shifted beneath them, revealing something they feared others might claim first. Meanwhile, the slab remained unchanged, silent, immovable. Inside the research outpost, the atmosphere grew heavy. Scientists gathered around large monitors, replaying the drone footage until exhaustion blurred their vision. Every second of interference was mapped, every sensor spike catalogued, every frame of distorted image traced for clues. There was something uncanny about the way the interference behaved, not random, not chaotic, but patterned. One physicist compared it to an encrypted broadcast, noise on the surface, meaning beneath. If it was intentional, it meant the slab was not just a seal, it was a control point. Some researchers proposed increasing the drone's output power to push through the interference. Others argued this was reckless, that the chamber might react unpredictably. A small but persuasive team suggested that the slab was responding defensively, not offensively. Whatever's behind it doesn't want to be approached, one said quietly. Or perhaps it simply wants to remain undisturbed until the correct conditions are met. The idea of correct conditions unsettled everyone. Conditions set by whom? By what? Theories proliferated faster than anyone could dismiss them. Some speculated the slab marked the resting place of a long-extinct civilization wiped out by the sudden freeze millions of years ago. Others believed it might be a relic of an unknown species that passed through Antarctica during its warm age. A few dared to suggest extraterrestrial involvement, a base, a vault, a forgotten outpost left behind in an epoch when Earth was not yet frozen. But none of these theories accounted for the most disturbing possibility, that whatever built this place did not simply abandon it. It sealed it. Deliberately. And yet the ice's movement over eons had not crushed it. Pressure that could flatten mountains had not warped its edges. Time had not eroded its surface. The slab remained intact, like something designed to withstand the planet's shifting skin. This resilience raised an unsettling question. Was the structure built before Antarctica froze, or during the freeze? If constructed before the freeze, its builders would have to possess knowledge beyond anything known in human prehistory. If constructed during the freeze, it would imply a survival and intelligence operating even as the continent plunged into eternal winter. Perhaps the builders fled. Perhaps they went dormant. Perhaps they were never meant to return. Or perhaps, as some quietly suggested, they never left. The drone footage revealed something else too. Something subtle but impossible to ignore. The slab was not perfectly centered within the chamber. It sat slightly off axis, as though once meant to slide, rotate, or lift. The wall around it bore microscopic fractures patterns resembling stress lines, as if the slab had once moved or had been forced into place. The chamber, with its symmetrical planes, seemed designed to direct attention toward the slab, framing it like a focal point, the way modern architecture frames monumental entrances. Yet no mechanism was visible. No hinges, no rails, no seams. It was sealed with an elegance that transcended the mechanical, as though it closed itself. When the drone attempted a second approach days later, something changed. The feed remained stable. No interference. No downward pull. The slab remained as silent as before, but the chamber felt different. The atmosphere carried a weight, an expectation, as though it recognized the drone's presence, but no longer resisted it. Then, without warning, the drone's proximity sensors triggered, detecting a shape emerging in its path. But nothing was there. No object, no movement, just an invisible boundary, like a wall of pressure. The drone stopped, unable to proceed. Behind the slab, deeper readings flickered momentary glimpses of what could have been a massive spherical chamber, or perhaps multiple interconnected spaces. But before the data could be captured, the radar cut out again, and this time, it did not return. The drone drifted backward, its lights flickering, its sensors disoriented. Something inside the mountain had communicated not with words or signals, but with refusal. The slab was not merely sealed. It was guarding something that for now had chosen to remain unheard. The moment the drone's second attempt was repelled by an invisible boundary, the scientific world understood something quietly devastating. Whatever lay beyond the slab in the Antarctic chamber was not merely hidden, it was actively resisting discovery. And in a world that had grown accustomed to believing every frontier could be mapped, measured, digitized, and explained, the idea of a structure pushing back felt almost mythic. But myth or not, the consequences were real. Within hours of the failed second approach, encrypted transmissions circulated among research bases on the continent. Some messages carried veiled warnings: avoid speculation, halt independent scans, report all anomalies directly to designated authorities. Others, darker and less official, spoke of increased military presence near King George Island's mall teams, disguised as logistical support. Landing quietly in the night, governments seldom admit fear, but their actions had already betrayed them. The slab, and whatever it guarded, represented a possibility too monumental to ignore. If it belonged to an ancient civilization, the discovery would rewrite human history. If it was extraterrestrial, the implications stretched beyond the planet itself. If it was some unknown geological mechanism, the technology embedded within could be unprecedented. Whatever the truth, every major power wanted it first and wanted others to have it last. Inside universities and research institutions, fractures deepened. Departments that once collaborated now argued bitterly over interpretations. Professors went on record, then regretted it. Some claimed the structure was a natural formation shaped by catastrophic freeze cycles. Others insisted the chamber was too symmetrical, the geometry too intentional, the interference too orchestrated to be geological. Each interview, each article, each peer-reviewed paper seemed only to widen the gap between belief and denial. Meanwhile, the public had already made up its mind. The leaked drone footage, though grainy and incomplete, became the most analyzed set of images since the Apollo missions. Amateur researchers on every continent dissected it frame by frame, building models, simulations, and theories. Some proposed architectural parallels with ancient temples. Others compared the slab to megalithic structures across the world, sites whose construction still challenges modern engineering. A few went further, suggesting a global pattern: enigmatic structures positioned in remote regions, all pointing to a civilization far older than recorded history. Social media overflowed with speculation. Some theories spread like wildfire: claims of a lost antediluvian empire, of pre-human intelligence, of visitors from elsewhere who built structures in Earth's temperate zones before retreating underground. The more outlandish theories were dismissed publicly, but investigated privately. Governments issued calm, measured statements. There is no confirmed evidence of a man-made structure beneath the Antarctic ice, but their increased presence on the continent suggested the opposite. What terrified officials wasn't what the public believed. It was what the public might eventually be correct about. Concerns grew that the opening on King George Island might not be the only entrance to the structure. If similar geometry lay hidden beneath the ice across the continent and data strongly suggested it did, then the scale of whatever was buried could be immense. Some scientists speculated it could span hundreds of kilometers, a network of chambers interconnected by tunnels carved before the freeze, a megastructure, an underground city, or something even larger, something beyond human architectural comparison. In internal reports, a term began appearing more frequently: subglacial subsystem. The phrase, carefully chosen, avoided the implication of intelligence while acknowledging intentional layout. It meant the anomalies were not isolated. They were components, parts of a whole, and that whole was awakening. Tensions escalated further when several satellites orbiting over Antarctica recorded brief electromagnetic distortions as they passed near the King George anomaly. The disturbances were subtle but undeniable anomalies in frequency bands that should have remained silent. Analysts debated the cause: atmospheric interference, instrument malfunction, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Each distortion occurred precisely when the satellite crossed a trajectory aligned with the chamber's coordinates. One engineer summarized the implications with a quiet unease: something down there is responding. As pressure mounted, world governments took predictable steps. Proposals surfaced for joint investigations, multinational teams with equal access to the site, but these proposals collapsed almost instantly, each nation unwilling to share control of the discovery. Slowly, silently, the Antarctic Treaty, one of humanity's last peaceful agreements, began to fracture. Research stations near King George Island felt the shift before the world did. Communications lagged without explanation. Travel corridors were restricted. Incoming flights were delayed, rescheduled, or canceled. Routine maintenance crews found themselves questioned by unfamiliar personnel. Scientists noticed drones, military-grade ones, circling overhead without transponders. It became clear that the anomaly was no longer just a scientific curiosity. It was a matter of sovereignty, secrecy, and fear. And yet, amid the geopolitical tension, a quieter conversation unfolded among the researchers who had studied the anomaly longest. They wondered aloud whether humans were meant to open the slab at all. The structure had survived cataclysms, plate drift, mass extinction events, and the crushing weight of 4 kilometers of ice. It had endured untouched through cycles that destroyed entire species. Its purpose, whatever it was, had been preserved with extraordinary care. Why? Was it a vault built to protect something? Or a prison designed to contain it? Was it a refuge? A warning? A relic? A technology beyond human comprehension? Or something else? Something mankind lacked the vocabulary to define. Some researchers believed it held knowledge records of a forgotten past or instructions for a distant future. Others suspected it contained a power source, dormant but intact. A few, the most cautious among them, feared it held something alive, trapped since the earth shifted and froze around it. And though these ideas remained whispered, one truth became impossible to deny: the slab was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. Because in the final radar scans captured before the interference overwhelmed all instruments, a single shape appeared, brief, blurred, almost subliminal. A sphere the size of a cathedral, suspended within a larger chamber behind the slab, perfectly round, perfectly still. No natural geological process creates a hollow sphere, especially not one hovering in symmetry within a sealed chamber. The shape lasted less than 2 seconds before the feed cut out forever. But in those 2 seconds, the world changed. The cave on King George Island was no longer a mystery of geology. It was a doorway into something ancient, something engineered, something waiting. And for the first time in human history, we were close enough to see its shadow. Long after the final radar image flickered and died, long after the anomalous spherical chamber blurred into unrecognizable static, the world found itself holding its breath. The Antarctic structure, once dismissed as an internet illusion or a geological curiosity, had crossed a threshold from speculation into undeniability. Something existed beneath the ice, something engineered, something vast. And whatever it was, it had remained hidden far longer than the age of humanity itself. Across the world, news outlets covered the story with cautious interest. Some journalists framed it as a scientific breakthrough. Others whispered of a suppressed discovery. A few dared to describe it as the first tangible sign of a forgotten epoch, an era erased by time, preserved beneath the thickest ice on Earth. But none of them, not even the most daring, came close to capturing the weight of what the researchers felt in their bones. It wasn't the structure itself that shook them. It wasn't the stairway, or the chamber, or the slab, or even the black basin that pulled at the drone like a living tide. It was the undeniable sensation that the structure was not dormant, not lifeless, not abandoned. It was waiting. The timing of its reveal seemed almost deliberate. After millions of years concealed beneath impenetrable ice, why now? Why this decade? Why this generation? Had the shifting climate thinned the ice just enough for satellites to catch a sliver of its shape? Or had the structure itself responded to something: our presence, our signals, our accidental touch upon its sealed surface? Some researchers speculated that the interference patterns were not defensive at all, but communicative, a kind of probing, a test of contact. Others argued that the forced relocation of the drone indicated something more conscious, an act of rejection rather than curiosity. But no matter how they interpreted the data, one truth spiraled through every theory. The structure behaved as though it recognized intrusion, and the slab, the monolithic barrier at the chamber's end, remained unmoved, impenetrable, immovable. Yet the faint radar glimpses of the enormous sphere behind it left a lingering unease. If the sphere was part of a mechanism, it could be ancient technology. If it was a dwelling, something might rest inside it. If it was containment, then humanity might have stumbled upon something sealed away for reasons beyond comprehension. Governments debated access protocols. Scientists drafted theoretical models. Intelligence agencies speculated about the potential for advanced energy sources or unknown materials. Religious groups issued statements interpreting the discovery as symbolic or prophetic. But the truth, raw and unsettling, eluded everyone, because the structure refused to reveal itself further. The slab did not open. The interference did not weaken. The chamber did not change. It existed in a state of watching, as though assessing us with the same caution we directed toward it. In an emergency summit, world leaders discussed the possibility of drilling down for direct human entry. But engineers warned that even the slightest miscalculation could collapse the entire chamber, burying whatever lay within and anyone attempting to reach it under thousands of tons of ice. Others argued that entering the structure might trigger unknown consequences. After all, if it had remained sealed for millions of years, perhaps it was meant to stay sealed. Meanwhile, Antarctica remained indifferent. Snowstorms erased tracks overnight. Winds howled through empty valleys. And beneath that vast silence, a structure unlike anything on Earth continued to rest in the dark. A monument to something lost, or a message left for a future species capable of finding it. Humanity stood at the edge of a revelation, yet the ice refused to give more. The doorway remained closed. And so, tonight, as we drift away from the cold corridors beneath Antarctica, let the mind soften. Let the edges of this mystery fade like fog over a frozen sea. The ice, ancient and unmoving, still sleeps above the chamber. The slab remains sealed. The sphere waits behind it, untouched and unseen. Nothing has changed, and yet everything has. Because once you learn that such a place exists, once you understand that something impossible lies beneath the quiet surface of our world, the planet feels different, larger, older, less familiar. You begin to sense the weight of silence in ways you never noticed before. You start to wonder what else lies hidden beneath oceans, deserts, mountains, or even in the sky above. But not everything hidden calls to be found. Some mysteries stand not as invitations, but as reminders, gentle, distant whispers telling us that the world is far more complicated than we imagine. Antarctica offers no answers tonight. Only stillness. Only the patient breathing of the ice. Only the echo of questions that will remain long after we leave the continent behind. So allow yourself, just for now, to step back from the threshold. Let the chamber grow dark again. Let the strange basin, the silent slab, the blurred sphere recede into the quiet they belonged to for millions of years. You are safe here, at the edge of the unknown, watching from afar. And someday, perhaps sooner than we expect, the ice will shift again. Another doorway will open, and the world will once more be asked to listen. Fade now into rest. The mystery remains, but it does not follow you. Not tonight.